Imagine standing on the rain-swept cliffs of southern England in the spring of 1944 and looking out across the English Channel toward a horizon that no longer exists. Instead of open water, you see steel. Mile after mile after mile of steel. Warships of every class jostle for position alongside transports, landing craft, tankers, hospital ships and minesweepers. The sea itself seems to have been replaced by a floating city of iron and canvas and rope. The noise is extraordinary. Engines rumbling, cranes clanking, sailors shouting orders in a dozen accents, the occasional bark of a gun being tested. Smoke rises from funnels in lazy columns and mingles with the grey English sky. And if you are a British general who has spent the last 5 years watching the war grind through North Africa, Sicily, Italy and a dozen other desperate campaigns, the sight before you is almost impossible to believe. This is what American industrial power looks like when it is fully unleashed. This is Operation Overlord. This is the greatest amphibious invasion the world has ever seen or will ever see. And some of the most seasoned military men in the British Empire are standing on those cliffs with their mouths open. The story of D-Day, June 6, 1944, has been told from many angles. We know about the paratroopers who jumped into Normandy before dawn, the infantry who waded ashore under fire at Omaha Beach, the rangers who scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, and the politicians in London and Washington who held their breath through the longest day in modern history. But there is another story, told in private diaries, classified memoranda, post-war memoirs, and the candid recollections of men who were there at the highest levels of Allied planning. It is the story of what Britain's senior commanders actually thought when they watched the American war machine arrive in Britain, assemble in their harbours, and then pour out across the sea toward France. Some of those reactions were admiring. Some were quietly envious. Some were alarmed, and some were complicated by weeks and months of bitter inter-Allied argument, professional jealousy, and the grinding tension that always exists when two proud nations try to fight a war together. In this video, we will explore exactly what British generals and admirals said, wrote and felt when they witnessed the staggering power of the American invasion fleet assembled for D-Day. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. General Sir Frederick Morgan was, in many ways, the man who built the house that Eisenhower moved into. Before the Supreme Commander arrived from Washington, before Montgomery was handed command of the ground forces, before the Great American Armada began assembling in British ports, it was a relatively obscure British Lieutenant General named Frederick Morgan who sat in a London office and began drafting the plan that would become Operation Overlord. Morgan had been appointed Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander in April 1943, a title abbreviated to the memorable acronym Cossack, and his job was essentially impossible. He had been asked to plan the liberation of Western Europe with no supreme commander yet appointed, a severe shortage of landing craft and very little certainty about the resources that would ultimately be available. What he produced, nonetheless, was a workable outline plan that identified Normandy as the landing site, proposed a 5-division assault across a 50-mile front, and outlined the elaborate deception schemes that would eventually become Operation Bodyguard. Morgan was an artillery officer by training, a veteran of the First World War who had served in France and was intimately familiar with the catastrophic consequences of poorly planned offensives. By 1943, he had accumulated enough experience in combined operations to understand what an assault on Hitler's Atlantic Wall would require. His early planning meetings were often frustrating affairs. The Americans, still building their forces, were generous with enthusiasm, but short on hard commitments. The British, exhausted by 4 years of war, were generous with experience but sometimes resistant to the sheer scale of what the Americans were proposing. Morgan himself occupied an awkward middle ground, trying to reconcile British caution with American boldness, while simultaneously arguing with both sides for more landing craft. When Morgan first saw the preliminary figures for American troop deployments to Britain, he described the experience as something close to physical vertigo. Writing in his memoir, he recalled standing in front of a logistics chart that listed the divisions, the ships, the aircraft, the vehicles, and the tons of supplies scheduled to arrive in the United Kingdom over the 18 months leading up to the projected invasion, and feeling what he could only describe as a mixture of profound relief and something approaching awe. The numbers were simply of a different magnitude than anything the British Empire could have generated on its own. By the time D-Day arrived, the United States had deployed more than 1.5 million soldiers to Britain, a figure that dwarfed the entire standing army with which Britain had gone to war in 1939. Morgan understood, as clearly as anyone in the Allied command structure, that the liberation of Europe was going to be an American enterprise in a way that some of his countrymen had not yet fully grasped. But Morgan also harboured private reservations, and he was candid about them in his papers. He worried, in the early months of planning, about American organisational capacity at the operational level. The United States Army had expanded at a breathtaking pace, transforming from a peacetime force of fewer than 200,000 men in 1940 to a wartime colossus of more than 8 million by 1945. That kind of expansion inevitably created gaps in experience and training that even the most capable officers could not fully paper over. Morgan had watched American units perform in North Africa, where they had suffered serious reverses before finding their footing, and in Sicily, where the command relationships between British and American forces had generated considerable friction. He was not dismissive of American soldiers, far from it, but he was realistic about the learning curve involved. What he saw when the American fleet began to arrive reassured him on the logistical side far more than it reassured him on the tactical side. The Americans could move mountains. Whether they could put those mountains in exactly the right places at exactly the right time remained to be seen. Morgan eventually gave way to Eisenhower and accepted a subordinate role in the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, known as SHAF. He served loyally and effectively through the campaign, though his relationship with some of his American colleagues was occasionally strained. After the war, he wrote with characteristic British restraint about the experience of watching the American build-up. The phrase he used most often was "organised chaos," which he meant not as an insult but as a genuine description of the American method. A tendency to throw enormous resources at a problem and then find a way to make those resources work, even if the initial approach was untidy by British standards. It was, he acknowledged, a method that ultimately succeeded, and the sight of the invasion fleet confirmed for him that whatever tactical debates might lie ahead, the sheer weight of American power was going to be decisive. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke was perhaps the most intellectually formidable British soldier of the Second World War, and his diaries remain among the most revealing documents left behind by any senior commander of that conflict. Brooke served as Chief of the Imperial General Staff from December 1941 until the end of the war, meaning he sat at the apex of British military planning throughout the entire period of the Allied partnership with the United States. He attended every major Allied conference, argued strategy with Marshall, Roosevelt and Churchill in equal measure, and developed a complex, evolving relationship with the American military establishment that was simultaneously admiring and deeply critical. Brooke had expected to command Overlord himself. Churchill had hinted as much, and Brooke had allowed himself to believe it. When Roosevelt insisted that an American must command the invasion, given the size of the American contribution, and when Eisenhower was chosen over the heads of the more senior Marshall and Brooke himself, the British general was devastated. He confided the depth of his disappointment to his diary in unusually raw terms, writing that the decision had been one of the bitterest moments of his life. He never entirely overcame the sense that he had been denied his place in history, and this background of personal loss coloured his assessments of American performance throughout the campaign. Brooke was, in short, predisposed to be critical of his American counterparts, and his diaries reflect that predisposition with a candour that shocked many readers when they were eventually published in the 1950s. Yet even Brooke, with all of his reservations, was struck by the scale of the American effort. In late May 1944, he travelled with Churchill and other senior commanders to review portions of the invasion fleet assembled in the Solent and in the ports of southern England. What he saw in those harbours and anchorages produced, even in his sceptical mind, a reaction that he could not easily dismiss. He wrote that evening that one could be forgiven for thinking that the whole of the industrial output of the most powerful nation on earth had somehow been compressed into these anchorages and set afloat. The sheer number of vessels of every type and size was, he admitted, a sight of a kind that he had never expected to see in his lifetime. He noted the LSTs, landing ship tanks, lined up in rows like terraced houses, each one capable of carrying a dozen or more tanks directly onto a beach. He noted the destroyers and cruisers that would provide gunfire support, their gun barrels clean and freshly painted. He noted the extraordinary variety of specialized craft that American ingenuity had developed for the assault phase: floating pontoons, rocket-firing vessels, amphibious trucks known as DUKWs, specialized tank landing craft with ramps that could drop directly onto a beach. Brooks' assessment of American generals was far less complimentary than his assessment of American industry. He was privately dismissive of Eisenhower's grasp of operational strategy, writing at various points that the Supreme Commander was more politician than soldier, more manager than commander. He respected Omar Bradley, who commanded the American ground forces, but considered him a limited tactician who thought in straight lines. His views on George Patton were even more ambivalent. Brooke recognized Patton's aggressive energy as genuinely useful, but doubted his judgment and worried about his tendency toward recklessness. These private opinions did not substantially alter Brooke's public conduct, which was correct and cooperative, but they are worth knowing because they illuminate the particular quality of British admiration for the American effort. It was admiration mixed with condescension, respect mixed with rivalry, genuine gratitude mixed with genuine frustration. What Brooke did say without qualification was that without American manpower and American industry, the invasion could not have happened in 1944. He said it in conversations, in memoranda, and in his diaries, and he meant it without irony. Britain in 1944 was a nation that had been fighting for 5 years. Its manpower reserves were stretched. Its industrial capacity, formidable as it was, could not have produced the landing craft, the tanks, the aircraft, and the artillery that the invasion required in the quantities and on the timescale that Overlord demanded. The American contribution was not merely large. It was, in Brooke's considered judgment, the decisive material factor in the liberation of Western Europe. Saying so cost him something, given his personal investment in the idea of British strategic leadership of the coalition. But he said it clearly. Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery was one of the most discussed, most admired, most criticised and most thoroughly analysed commanders of the Second World War, and his role in D-Day was central enough that no account of British reactions to the invasion can proceed without him. Montgomery was appointed commander of 21st Army Group in December 1943, which meant he would lead all Allied ground forces during the initial phase of the Normandy campaign. He was, in British eyes, the hero of El Alamein, the man who had defeated Rommel in the desert when British arms desperately needed a victory. He was also, in American eyes, infuriatingly slow, chronically overcautious, and constitutionally incapable of acknowledging that anyone else might have a useful idea. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between these extremes, but both characterizations contained enough truth to generate real tension within the Allied command. Montgomery's first significant intervention in the planning for D-Day came when he arrived in London in January 1944 and immediately declared that the Cossack plan was inadequate. The original plan had called for a 3-division assault across a front that Montgomery considered too narrow. He insisted on broadening the attack to 5 divisions on a wider front, adding the Utah Beach sector on the right flank and expanding the British and Canadian sectors on the left. This decision, which most historians now consider correct, required a corresponding increase in landing craft that could only be obtained by delaying the invasion from May to June 1944. Morgan, whose plan was being substantially revised, was not entirely pleased, but the strategic logic was sound, and Eisenhower supported the change. When Montgomery surveyed the fleet that had been assembled to implement his expanded plan, his reaction was characteristically confident. He had spent the preceding weeks touring training exercises and reviewing unit preparations, delivering the pep talks for which he was famous, and working through the detailed operational plan that would guide the assault. By the time he stood on a platform in Portsmouth Harbour in late May 1944 and looked out at the assembled armada, he was in the grip of the peculiar calm that sometimes descends on commanders who have done everything in their power to prepare and who must now simply wait. He told his staff that the sight of the fleet convinced him that the plan would work. He said it with the confidence of a man who did not easily acknowledge the possibility of failure and who believed with some justification that the weight of material assembled on those waters was sufficient to overcome any obstacle the Germans could place in its path. Privately, Montgomery had specific admiration for certain elements of the American preparation. He was impressed in particular by the quality of American logistics, which he had seen at work in the Mediterranean, and which he recognized as genuinely superior to the British equivalent in certain respects. The Americans were able to sustain forward units with a regularity and volume of supply that the British could rarely match, and Montgomery, who was a careful logistician despite his reputation for caution, appreciated this. He was less impressed by the American approach to tactical planning, which he considered insufficiently detailed and too reliant on the initiative of junior commanders rather than careful prior coordination. This was a genuine doctrinal difference between the two armies that would cause friction throughout the campaign, not merely a matter of British snobbery. What did Montgomery actually say when he saw the American fleet? There is a story, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, that on the morning of June 5th, as the invasion fleet began to move out of its harbours in the teeth of a near gale, Montgomery stood on the bridge of his command ship and said something to the effect that it was too big to fail. Whether he actually said it in those words is uncertain, but the sentiment was genuine. By 1944, Montgomery had developed a sophisticated understanding of what overwhelming material superiority could accomplish, and he had no doubt that the force assembled in those waters was overwhelming. The question was not whether it could land. The question was, what would happen after it did? Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay was the naval commander for Operation Neptune, which was the naval component of Operation Overlord, and in many ways, the most extraordinary organisational achievement of the entire campaign. Ramsay had been responsible for the naval side of the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, an operation that had saved more than 300,000 men from the beaches of northern France in circumstances of tremendous improvisation and danger. He had also commanded the naval forces for the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. By the time he was appointed naval commander, Allied Expeditionary Force in October 1943, he was perhaps the most experienced amphibious naval commander in the world, and the operation he was being asked to plan was of a scale that made everything he had done previously look modest. The figures for Operation Neptune are worth dwelling on, because they provide the most concrete way of grasping why British observers found the assembled fleet so astonishing. Ramsay's armada comprised approximately 6,939 vessels of all types. This included 1,213 warships, ranging from battleships and cruisers down to motor torpedo boats. There were 4,126 landing ships and landing craft of various types, 736 ancillary vessels, including repair ships, tankers, and accommodation ships, and 864 merchant vessels. The naval personnel involved numbered approximately 195,700, drawn from the navies of Britain, the United States, Canada, and a dozen other allied nations. The American contribution was the largest single national contribution in terms of landing craft and transport vessels, though the British Royal Navy provided the largest number of warships. Ramsay was not a man given to theatrical expressions of emotion, but those who knew him noted that even he seemed affected by the sight of his assembled fleet. He had spent months living with the operational plan, the logistics tables, the convoy schedules, the mine-sweeping charts, and the gunfire support plans that were required to move this armada across the Channel and deliver its cargo of soldiers onto the beaches of Normandy. When the reality of what he had organised materialised around him in late May 1944, in the form of thousands of actual ships with actual crews preparing for the actual operation, he permitted himself a moment of genuine satisfaction. He told his chief of staff that it was, he supposed, the largest thing he had ever seen, which was, for Bertram Ramsay, effusive praise. His concerns were practical rather than emotional. He worried about the weather, which was going to be critical for the landing craft in particular. He worried about the German mine-sweeping capacity and the possibility that mines might disrupt the convoy lanes across the Channel. He worried about the coordination between the naval gunfire support ships and the soldiers on the beaches, which required a degree of real-time communication that had not always worked smoothly in previous operations. And he worried, as all naval commanders of amphibious operations must worry, about what happens when the plan meets the enemy. But the fleet itself, when he looked at it, answered most of his worries in the most direct possible way. If this force could not accomplish the task, nothing could. And Ramsay believed, with the calm certainty of a professional who had done his work as well as it could be done, that it could accomplish the task. One of the more remarkable details that Ramsay noted in his diary concerned the contrast between the American vessels and the British ones. The American landing ships were newer, on average. better equipped, and in some respects more capable than their British equivalents. The Americans had also developed a variety of specialised landing craft that the Royal Navy had been slow to adopt, including the LST, the LCVP, and the LCI, all of which had proven their value in the Pacific and the Mediterranean. Ramsay was not a proud man in the petty sense, and he acknowledged these advantages without embarrassment. What struck him most forcibly was not the comparison between American and British equipment, but the simple, irreducible fact that there was so much of it. The Americans had not merely caught up with British experience in amphibious warfare, they had applied their industrial resources to the problem with such thoroughness that they had, in many respects, gone beyond it. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory commanded the Allied Expeditionary Air Force for the D-Day operation, which meant he was responsible for the tactical air support that would prepare the invasion beaches, suppress the Luftwaffe, and provide cover for the fleet and the landing troops. Leigh-Mallory was, by the spring of 1944, one of the most controversial figures in the Allied command structure. He had been at the centre of the bitter arguments over fighter tactics during the Battle of Britain, where he had championed the big wing concept against the objections of Keith Park and Dowding. He was regarded by some of his contemporaries as capable but abrasive, and his relationships with the American air commanders were particularly strained. His most public disagreement concerned the planned American airborne drops on the Cotentin Peninsula in the hours before the seaborne landings. Leigh-Mallory was convinced that the paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would be massacred. The German defences on the Cotentin were dense, the drop zones were heavily flooded, and the anti-aircraft fire along the flight paths was, in his estimation, sufficient to cause catastrophic losses. In a letter to Eisenhower on May 29, 1944, just 8 days before the invasion, Leigh-Mallory formally recorded his opinion that the operation would result in the loss of approximately 70% of the glider troops and 50% of the paratroopers, figures which, if accurate, would have represented a military disaster of the first order. He asked Eisenhower to cancel or substantially modify the airborne operation. Eisenhower refused. He heard Leigh-Mallory's arguments, consulted with the airborne commanders, and decided that the risk was acceptable given the operational importance of securing the flanks of the landing beaches. It was one of the most difficult decisions of the Supreme Commander's career, and he was honest enough to admit afterward that he had not been certain he was right. As it turned out, Leigh-Mallory's predictions were not borne out. American airborne losses, while significant, were far below the catastrophic levels he had predicted. The drops were scattered and chaotic, but the soldiers found each other in the dark Norman countryside and accomplished most of their objectives. Leigh-Mallory wrote Eisenhower a personal note the day after the invasion, acknowledging that he had been wrong and that he was delighted to have been wrong. It was, in its way, a generous admission from a man who did not find generosity easy. Leigh-Mallory's reaction to the invasion fleet was filtered through his particular professional lens, which was aerial in its emphasis. What he wanted to know, above everything else, was whether the fleet's anti-aircraft defences were adequate. The German Luftwaffe had been severely weakened by the spring of 1944, but it had not been eliminated, and a determined attack on the invasion fleet during the crossing could have caused significant casualties. He had spent months arguing for enhanced fighter cover over the fleet, and for the suppression of German airfields in France before the invasion. When he reviewed the anti-aircraft arrangements and the fighter escort plans in the final weeks before D-Day, he was cautiously reassured. The fleet was going to be well protected. The question of whether his bombers and fighter bombers could adequately suppress the beach defences in the hours before the landings remained, in his view, the most significant tactical uncertainty. What Leigh-Mallory saw when he looked at the physical fleet was not quite what Morgan or Brooke or Ramsay saw. He saw it through the eyes of an airman for whom ships were potential targets as much as potential assets. He noted the density of the anchorages in the harbours of southern England and worried briefly about what the Luftwaffe could accomplish if it managed to penetrate the fighter screen and reach those anchorages with a serious bombing force. He noted the vulnerability of the LSTs in particular, which were large, slow, and inflammable when loaded with vehicles and fuel. He noted the inadequacy of the smoke screen arrangements that were supposed to protect the ships in the initial assault phase. He communicated all of these concerns to the appropriate commanders, received assurances he did not entirely trust, and proceeded to do his job as well as he could under the circumstances. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder held the title of Deputy Supreme Commander under Eisenhower, which made him the second-ranking officer in the entire Allied command structure. Tedder was an unusual figure in the British military. Firmament, an intellectual, a scientist's son who had read history at Cambridge, a man who thought in systematic terms about the relationship between air power and surface operations. He had served as Air Commander-in-Chief for the Mediterranean Theatre before being appointed to his chaff role, and he had developed there, in collaboration with the American General Carl Spaatz, the theories of air interdiction that became known as the Transportation Plan. This plan, which Tedder championed vigorously and which eventually prevailed over alternative proposals, aimed to use strategic and tactical bombers to sever the rail and road network of France and thus prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy after the invasion. Tedder's relationship with Eisenhower was close and genuinely productive. He was perhaps the British officer in the Allied command who most completely transcended the national jealousies and competitive instincts that complicated so many Anglo-American relationships. He thought of himself as a servant of the coalition rather than a representative of one national tradition, and his ability to work effectively with American commanders was a genuine asset to the enterprise. He was also, perhaps for this reason, occasionally regarded with some suspicion by more nationally minded British officers who wondered whether he was too quick to accommodate American preferences. When Tedder reviewed the assembled invasion fleet, his response was characteristically analytical. He noted the composition of the fleet in terms of its capacity to project air power, the carriers, the catapult aircraft, the shipborne radar equipment. He was thinking about the air battle over the beaches on D-Day morning, about how the tactical air forces would fit into the larger pattern of the operation, about what the weather would need to be for the air plan to work as intended. He was, in short, thinking about his job, which was a form of respect for the enterprise that expressed itself through professional attention rather than emotional response. But he did tell colleagues afterward that the sight of the fleet had confirmed for him something he had suspected, but had not quite been able to visualize until he saw it, that the weight of the Allied air effort, combined with the weight of the naval and land forces assembled in those harbours, was sufficient to overwhelm any defence the Germans could mount, provided the weather cooperated and the deception plan held. The deception plan Tedder was thinking about was Operation Bodyguard, and particularly its most elaborate component, Operation Fortitude. This was the scheme involving false radio traffic, dummy armies, double agents, and carefully constructed misinformation that was designed to persuade the Germans that the main invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The success of Fortitude was absolutely central to the success of Overlord, because if the Germans moved their panzer reserves to Normandy in the critical hours and days after the landing, they might have been able to push the Allied forces back into the sea. As long as they believed the Normandy landing was a feint and the main blow was still coming at Calais, they would hold those reserves back. Thus, Tedder understood this at a strategic level, and he understood that even the most overwhelming invasion fleet could be defeated if it faced the full weight of German armour concentrated against it in the first 48 hours. General Sir Miles Dempsey commanded the British Second Army, which would land the British and Canadian troops on the Gold, Juno and Sword beaches on D-Day. Dempsey is one of the less celebrated figures of the Normandy campaign, consistently overshadowed by the more flamboyant Montgomery, who commanded 21st Army Group and above whom Dempsey reported. This obscurity is somewhat unfair to a man who was, in the judgment of many who served with him, a thoughtful and effective army commander. Montgomery trusted him completely, perhaps more completely than he trusted any other subordinate, and the fact that Dempsey rarely sought personal publicity was, in Montgomery's view, a mark of professional character rather than a limitation. Dempsey had commanded 13th Corps in the Sicilian and Italian campaigns before taking over Second Army, and he had developed a clear appreciation of both the strengths and the limitations of British infantry tactics as they had evolved through the long apprenticeship in North Africa and the Mediterranean. He knew that his troops were capable of fighting effectively, but that they were not inexhaustible, and he was determined to use artillery and armour to do as much of the killing as possible, rather than sacrificing his infantrymen unnecessarily. This approach, sometimes criticised by American observers as overly cautious, reflected the grim arithmetic of British manpower at this stage of the war. Britain was running out of men. Every casualty now was a casualty that could not be replaced. When Dempsey surveyed the forces assembled for the British sector of the invasion, he was struck most powerfully by something that had less to do with the Americans per se, and more to do with the overall scale of the preparation. He noted in his diary that the fleet assembled for just the British and Canadian sectors of the operation would have been, by itself, among the largest amphibious forces ever assembled in history. And this was only part of the total force. The American contribution, which dwarfed the British in terms of sheer numbers of vessels and men, was being loaded simultaneously in other ports across the south of England. The combined effect, Dempsey wrote, was almost literally beyond comprehension. He found himself unable to hold the full picture in his mind at once and had to break it down into the specific operational details that directly concerned his army. His specific concern on the eve of D-Day was the beach obstacles. German engineers had spent months constructing elaborate barriers of stakes, mines, and steel obstacles in the water along the invasion beaches, designed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft before they reached the shore. The specialized engineer teams that would neutralize these obstacles had trained extensively, but the obstacles were dense and the time window for clearing lanes before the tide covered them was narrow. Dempsey worried about this as he worried about many things, methodically and without excessive emotion. What he did not worry about, looking at the fleet, was whether the force was large enough. It was large enough. Whether it could execute effectively under fire was a different question, and that was the question that kept him awake at night. General Sir Harold Alexander was the British general who perhaps best articulated the complicated mixture of admiration and anxiety that characterized British reactions to American military power. Alexander had commanded the 18th Army Group in Tunisia, where he had supervised American as well as British and Commonwealth forces, and his experience with the American army in combat had given him a particular and strongly held view of its strengths and weaknesses. That view was not always flattering, and it caused significant diplomatic difficulties at various points during the Mediterranean campaign. But Alexander was also, beneath his surface charm, a perceptive observer of military affairs, and his comments on the invasion fleet deserve attention. Alexander had been alarmed in Tunisia by the poor performance of certain American units in the early months of that campaign. The disaster at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, when German forces under Rommel broke through American positions and inflicted heavy casualties, had convinced Alexander that the American army, however promising its potential, was not yet a polished instrument of war. He communicated these concerns to Alan Brooke, who relayed them to Churchill, and the resulting impression at the highest levels of British command was that American troops, whatever their individual bravery, lacked the professional coordination and tactical sophistication of experienced British and German units. This impression would prove increasingly obsolete as the American army gained experience, but it was deeply embedded in British military thinking by the time the planning for Overlord began, and it influenced British attitudes toward the American contribution in ways that were not always constructive. When Alexander saw what the Americans had assembled for D-Day in terms of equipment, logistics, and sheer numbers, he was, by his own account, compelled to revise some of his earlier assumptions. Not about tactics, perhaps, but about scale. The American capacity to field, equip, and supply an army of this size in a foreign country across thousands of miles of ocean was something that no military planner could simply dismiss as a product of industrial wealth alone. It required organizational sophistication of a high order, and Alexander, whatever his reservations about American battlefield tactics, recognized it. He told colleagues that the build-up had been executed with an efficiency that even the best British staff could not have bettered. Whether the troops could translate that organizational efficiency into battlefield effectiveness was, he acknowledged, still to be demonstrated in the particular conditions of Normandy. His specific comments about the invasion fleet were recorded by an aide who accompanied him on a tour of the Portsmouth area in the last week of May 1944. Alexander reportedly looked out at the anchorages for several minutes without speaking, then turned to his companion and said something to the effect that if the Germans could see what he was seeing, they would not sleep easily. It was for Alexander an unusually direct expression of approval. He then went on to note, with characteristic precision, that the real test was not what the fleet looked like, but what it could do, and that the what it could do was the question that would be answered in the next few days. He was right, of course, and the answer that the fleet gave in the event was largely positive. Winston Churchill's relationship with D-Day is one of the most discussed and most misunderstood aspects of the entire campaign. Churchill had opposed the cross-channel invasion for years, preferring what he called the soft underbelly approach of attacking Germany through the Mediterranean and the Balkans. His resistance to the American push for an early Second Front had been a source of constant friction with Roosevelt, and even more with Stalin. By 1944, he had been overruled by the logic of events and the weight of American opinion, and Operation Overlord was going forward whether he approved or not. But Churchill was not a man to be left at the margins of history, and his involvement in the final preparations for D-Day was characteristically energetic and occasionally exasperating to the military commanders who had to manage him. Churchill wanted to watch the D-Day landings from a warship. He proposed this to Eisenhower, who was appalled. The idea of the British Prime Minister being killed or captured on a Royal Navy cruiser during the initial assault phase was, to the Supreme Commander, one of the most alarming scenarios he could imagine. Eisenhower refused. Churchill then proposed to the Royal Navy that he simply sail as a crew member, which would technically remove him from Eisenhower's authority. This audacious suggestion was eventually resolved when King George VI announced that if Churchill was sailing, he was sailing too, a threat that forced Churchill to abandon the scheme, since no one was prepared to contemplate the king accompanying the invasion. Churchill's reaction to the assembled fleet was, characteristically, operatic. He had visited naval installations and troop concentration areas several times in the weeks leading up to the invasion, and his responses to what he saw were a mixture of genuine emotion and the theatrical quality that he brought to everything. He told members of his staff that the sight of the fleet was the most magnificent thing he had ever seen in his 70 years of life, which was saying a great deal from a man who had watched cavalry charges at Omdurman, served in the trenches in France, and survived the London Blitz. He wept, which was not unusual for Churchill, who wept fairly freely at moments of emotional intensity. He made speeches, which was also not unusual, and he expressed in private conversation with Brooke and others a mixture of pride in the Allied achievement and apprehension about the casualties that the assault was likely to inflict. Churchill's apprehension about casualties was real and deep, rooted in his memories of the First World War and particularly of the Gallipoli campaign, for which he bore significant personal responsibility and which had nearly destroyed his political career. The idea of another Gallipoli, of another ambitious amphibious assault turned into a bloody disaster, haunted him. When he looked at the invasion fleet, he saw not only the power that it represented, but also the vulnerability of the men who would be going ashore from it. He told Brooke, in one of their late-night conversations in the days before the invasion, that he prayed to God they were not sending the flower of British and American youth to their deaths on the beaches of Normandy. Brooke, who shared the anxiety, if not the eloquence, told him that they had done everything that military science could devise to minimize the risk, and that the rest was in the hands of the soldiers and the weather. The weather, as it turned out, was the most significant single variable in the entire operation, and the story of how the meteorological forecast determined the choice of D-Day is one of the great dramas of the campaign. The original plan had called for the invasion to begin on June 5th, 1944. The conditions required were specific: a period of relatively calm seas for the landing craft, a period of moonlight for the airborne operations, and a low tide at dawn for the beach engineers to clear the obstacles. These conditions coincided only briefly in each monthly cycle, which meant that if the June 5th date was missed, the next opportunity would not come until late June, with serious implications for the overall strategic timeline. On June 4, 1944, the weather deteriorated sharply, winds increased, seas roughened, and the cloud cover that the airborne operations required for the return flights of the transport aircraft became dangerously thick. Eisenhower and his commanders met in the early hours of June 4th in the library of Southwick House, a Georgian mansion north of Portsmouth that served as the operational headquarters for the naval side of the invasion, and heard the meteorological briefing from Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force. Stagg's forecast was grim. The invasion force had already begun to move. Some elements had to be recalled by radio, a process that risked alerting German intelligence to the imminence of the operation. The tension in that library was, by the accounts of all who were there, almost physical. What happened next is a famous moment in military history. Stagg returned on the morning of June 5th with a revised forecast. A narrow window of acceptable weather was opening, predicted to last approximately 24 to 36 hours, beginning in the early morning of June 6th. The seas would be rough but not impossible. The cloud cover would be broken enough for the airborne operations. The forecast was uncertain at the margins, and Stagg was honest about its limitations. But the window was real, and if Eisenhower did not take it, the next opportunity was 3 weeks away. Eisenhower asked his senior commanders for their opinions. Montgomery said, "Go." Ramsey said the Navy could do it. Lee Mallory expressed residual reservations. Tedder was cautious, and Eisenhower said, after a pause that those present never forgot, "Okay, we'll go." It was the loneliest decision in the history of the war. The entire enterprise, years of planning, thousands of ships, millions of men, the liberation of Europe, hung on the judgment of one man about whether a weather forecast was good enough. And it was Eisenhower, the American, who made it in a room full of experienced British and American officers who had presented him with no consensus. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, watching from the other side of the table, said nothing except that he agreed. It was, in its way, one of the most important expressions of Anglo-American trust in the entire war. The British were going into the storm on the word of an American Supreme Commander. The pre-invasion review that took place at Spithead in late May 1944 deserves special attention because it brought together more senior British commanders in one place than perhaps any event since the beginning of the war, and their collective reactions to what they saw constitute one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of Anglo-American relations. Spithead is the stretch of water between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight, traditionally used for great naval reviews, and what was assembled there in late May 1944 represented a visible summation of Allied naval power that had no precedent in history. The viewing party that assembled on the morning of May 26th included, among others, Alan Brooke, Trafford Leigh-Mallory, Bertram Ramsay, and representatives from the Canadian and other Allied commands. Churchill had visited separately, as had the King. The assembled officers looked out across a body of water that was, for practical purposes, no longer water but rather a mosaic of painted grey steel from one shore to the other, counting individual. Ships was impossible at any single point of view. The force stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, and the sounds and smells of 10,000 engines, 10,000 cook stoves, and the accumulated humanity of nearly 200,000 naval personnel permeated the air. Ramsay, whose professional composure was legendary, was seen by aides to stand in silence for an unusually long time before commenting. When he did speak, he said something that was recorded by his flag lieutenant and preserved in the Naval Historical Branch archives. He said that he had been at sea for the whole of his professional life, a period spanning more than 40 years, and that he had never seen anything like this. He paused, and then he said that he hoped to God they were doing the right thing with it. It was a remarkable statement from a man who had just spent a year and a half of his life organising the enterprise in question. But it captured something genuine about the moment, the gap between the confidence of preparation and the uncertainty of execution, the difference between a plan and its consequences. Brooke's comments at Spithead were, according to multiple witnesses, both admiring and characteristically analytical. He reportedly noted that the American ships in the anchorage outnumbered the British in a ratio that a year earlier would have seemed inconceivable, and that this ratio would only increase as the campaign proceeded. He said this without rancour, but with the awareness of a man who understood the strategic implications of American power for the post-war world. Britain had spent the first years of the war as the senior partner in the Atlantic Alliance. By June 1944, that seniority had passed irrevocably to the Americans, and the sight of Spithead made it concrete in a way that no statistical table could replicate. The American naval contribution to D-Day, which so struck British observers, had been assembled through a logistical process of staggering complexity. The United States had been building warships and landing craft at an industrial rate that no other nation could match. The massive LST program, for example, had produced more than 1,000 of these tank landing ships by June 1944, each requiring specialized construction techniques and several months of building time. The LCVPs, the small Higgins boats that would carry most of the assault infantry from ship to shore, had been produced by the tens of thousands in factories spread across the American South and Midwest. The Liberty ships that had kept Britain supplied through the worst years of the Battle of the Atlantic had been built at rates that defied belief, with some shipyards managing to launch a complete vessel in fewer than 5 days from keel laying to christening. The British officers who saw all of this in the harbours of southern England during the spring of 1944 were observing the product of a national industrial mobilisation, that had transformed the United States in 3 years from a peacetime economy of enormous potential to the most productive war economy the world had ever seen. American gross national product roughly doubled between 1940 and 1944. Steel production, aircraft production, shipbuilding, vehicle manufacturing, ammunition production. In every category, the figures were staggering. The United States was producing more war material than Germany, Japan, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined by 1944, and a very large proportion of that production was either afloat in those English harbours or waiting to be loaded onto ships. What made this particularly striking to British observers was the contrast with Britain's own industrial situation. Britain had mobilised its economy earlier and in some respects more thoroughly than the United States, and the British industrial achievement of the war years was genuinely remarkable. But Britain was a smaller country with fewer natural resources, a population barely a quarter of America's, and an economy that had been severely strained by 4 years of total war. By 1944, Britain was running government debts that would not be fully repaid for decades, dependent on American lend-lease for crucial supplies, and facing the prospect of the post-war world from a position of economic exhaustion that contrasted sharply with American prosperity. Senior British officers who saw the American industrial achievement daily in the form of the equipment around them understood this contrast at a visceral level, even when they did not discuss it explicitly. General Sir Bernard Paget had commanded home forces in Britain from 1941 to 1943, responsible for the defence of the British Isles and the training of the army that would eventually go to Europe. He was replaced in command as the focus shifted from defence to offence, and he spent much of the build-up to D-Day in a relatively peripheral role, but his earlier work had been crucial to the development of the training infrastructure that shaped the British and Canadian forces who would land in Normandy. Paget was a meticulous, demanding trainer who had imposed standards of realistic tactical preparation on the British Army that had been absent in the earlier years of the war. The men who came out of his training system were, by 1944, considerably more capable tactically than those who had fought in France in 1940 or Libya in 1941. Paget's reaction to the American build-up was filtered through his particular professional concern with training. He worried, throughout the winter and spring of 1943 to 44, about whether the American units arriving in Britain had been given the time and opportunity to prepare adequately for the specific challenges of an assault landing on a defended coast. American training facilities in the United States were excellent in many respects, but the particular terrain of the British training areas, the cliffs of Devon, the beaches of Scotland, the marshes of East Anglia, offered simulations of the Normandy environment that could not be replicated at home. He visited American training exercises on several occasions and came away with impressions that were, on the whole, more positive than he had expected. The American officers in particular struck him as eager learners who absorbed tactical lessons quickly, even if their previous experience had been different from what Normandy was going to require. What Paget saw when he visited the harbours of southern England was, above all, the product of American organisational energy applied to a military problem. He had spent years organising British training programmes that were constrained at every point by shortages of equipment, ranges, ammunition, vehicles, and time. What the Americans appeared to have was an absence of such constraints, or at least a capacity to overcome them that the British had rarely been able to match. He told a colleague that the Americans seemed to believe, as an article of institutional faith, that any problem could be solved by adding more resources to it, and that the extraordinary thing was that, given the resources the United States could generate, this belief was usually vindicated. Whether it would be vindicated on the beaches of Normandy remained to be seen. General Sir Frederick Pyle commanded Anti-Aircraft Command, responsible for the defence of British cities and installations against German air attack. His role in the D-Day enterprise was crucial but often overlooked. The anti-aircraft guns protecting the ports and concentration areas of southern England from German air attack were the last line of defence for the ships and troops assembling there. If the Luftwaffe had been able to mount a sustained bombing campaign against the anchorages at Portsmouth, Southampton, Dartmouth and Plymouth in the weeks before the invasion, the damage to the assembled fleet could have been severe. Pyle's command, in conjunction with the fighter squadrons of Air Defence Great Britain, had made such attacks prohibitively costly for the Germans, and the relative safety of the pre-invasion period owed much to his work. Pyle was also responsible for one of the more innovative uses of anti-aircraft weapons in the war, the deployment of AA guns on landing ships and barges to provide close-range protection during the crossing and the initial assault. This was a novel tactical requirement that his command had worked out in the preceding months, and it represented exactly the kind of practical problem-solving that characterized the best British staff work of the later war years. When Pyle saw the invasion fleet, his professional eye automatically catalogued the anti-aircraft armament of the vessels, calculating arcs of fire, identifying potential blind spots, assessing the adequacy of the defence against low-level attack. It was not perhaps the most romantic way to look at the greatest armada in history, but it was the professional response of a man who had spent years thinking about how to keep machines in the air from killing people on the ground. His overall assessment was cautiously optimistic. The Luftwaffe had been so severely damaged by the Allied strategic bombing campaign and by attrition in the fighter battles over Germany that it could no longer mount the kind of mass attacks on British targets that had characterized the Blitz. German air power in the West was still capable of causing problems, but it was not capable of preventing the invasion. Pyle said afterward that the sight of the fleet made him realize, in a way that no briefing could have communicated, that the invasion was truly irreversible. You could not look at that many ships carrying that many soldiers and imagine that the weight of German power in the West could prevent them from going ashore. The only question was whether going ashore would be enough. The question of what would happen after the landings was, in the spring of 1944, the central strategic debate in Allied planning. Montgomery believed that the Germans would commit their armoured reserves to contain the British and Canadian sector around Caen, and that this German commitment would create the conditions for an American breakout in the West. Critics of this plan, both at the time and since, argued that Montgomery never achieved the objectives he had initially set for Caen and used the drawing the armour theory retrospectively to excuse his slowness. American commanders, Bradley in particular, were increasingly frustrated by what they saw as Montgomery's failure to break through in the east, while demanding that American forces continue their costly fighting in the bocage country west of the Orne. This debate, which echoed through the campaign and through decades of subsequent historical controversy, had its roots in the planning arguments of the spring of 1944. What British observers saw when they looked at the invasion fleet was inevitably coloured by their own position in this debate. Those who believed in the primacy of British strategic judgment, like Brooke, tended to see the fleet as confirmation that British direction of the campaign could deliver victory if American muscle would only follow the right plan. Those who were more acutely aware of the American contribution, like Tedder and Ramsey, tended to see the fleet as evidence that the coalition was larger and more complex than any single national strategy could contain. And those who, like Montgomery, were most directly responsible for the operational plan, tended to see the fleet primarily as the instrument through which their plan would be executed, and to assess it accordingly. One of the more telling anecdotes about British reactions to the fleet comes from Brigadier General Sir James Gavin, the American airborne commander, who was not himself British, but who spent enough time with British senior officers in the weeks before D-Day to observe their responses. Gavin noted that British generals, almost without exception, were visibly impressed by the scale of the American naval contribution, but that they expressed this admiration in ways that were revealing of their deeper attitudes. They would speak of the fleet as if it were a natural force, like a river or a tidal wave, powerful but not entirely subject to human direction. They would contrast this with their own preference for precision, for careful planning, for the application of force at exactly the right point. The implication was that American power was brute force, and British skill was finesse, and that the combination of the two was what made victory possible. Gavin found this characterization partly accurate and partly self-flattering, and said so with characteristic American directness in his post-war memoirs. Whether the British characterization was fair is a question that military historians have been arguing since 1944, and which remains genuinely contested. What is not contested is that the fleet that sailed from England on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944 was an extraordinary demonstration of what two great industrial democracies could accomplish when they cooperated. British warships provided gunfire support for American troops on Omaha Beach. American landing craft carried British troops onto Gold Beach. Canadian troops who had trained in Scotland under British command used American equipment to assault Juno Beach. The national flags on individual vessels were less important than the fact that the vessels were all going in the same direction, toward the same coast, in support of the same plan. That plan, with all its flaws and compromises, was the product of Anglo-American cooperation on a scale that the world had never seen, and the fleet that executed it was its most visible and most powerful expression. The officers who were most directly involved in planning the naval side of the invasion found themselves, in the weeks before D-Day, in the grip of a peculiar professional emotion that combined pride in what had been, accomplished with anxiety about what was still ahead. Rear Admiral George Creasy served as Chief of Staff to Ramsay, and his observations provide some of the most technically detailed accounts of British professional reactions to the fleet. Creasy had worked through every operational problem that the Neptune plan presented, from the mine threat in the approaches to the channel ports to the problem of beach traffic control once thousands of vehicles were trying to move off the landing areas simultaneously. He had spent months on the logistics of the thing, on the consumption rates of fuel and ammunition, on the repair capacity of the harbour facilities, on the provision of fresh water for the troops ashore. When Creasy visited the anchorages and compared what he actually saw with the tables and charts that had previously represented those ships in his mind, he experienced something he described later as a moment of professional consummation, the sense that a plan which had existed only on paper had now become real in the most tangible possible way. He noted the LSTs with their bow doors open during loading exercises, the enormous ramps descending to the dock, tanks and trucks rolling aboard in columns. He noted the sailors moving purposefully about their vessels in the familiar routines of naval life, cleaning weapons, testing equipment, conducting the thousand small preparations that precede action at sea. He said that what struck him most was not the scale of the enterprise, but its orderliness. Given the number of ships and men involved, the sheer organizational complexity of moving all of these assets to their correct positions at the correct times was, to his professional eye, as remarkable as the material scale itself. Captain John Hughes Hallett, who had played a significant role in planning the naval aspects of the Dieppe raid in 1942 and had drawn harsh lessons from that disaster, had subsequently been deeply involved in the development of the artificial harbours, codename Mulberry, that were to be towed across the Channel and deployed off the invasion beaches. These Mulberry harbours were one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the entire war. Massive concrete caissons, breakwaters and floating roadways that would create artificial port facilities off the open beaches of Normandy, allowing the unloading of vehicles and supplies on a scale that would sustain the invading armies through the first critical weeks before a real port could be captured and put into operation. The project had consumed enormous resources of steel, concrete and engineering talent, and Hughes Hallett had been among its most persistent advocates. When Hughes Hallett saw the Mulberry components assembled in their various anchorages along the British coast, the enormous concrete caissons, the floating piers, the breakwater units, he felt a mixture of personal pride and professional anxiety. Pride because the project had required years of argument, experiment, and political struggle to bring to fruition. Anxiety because the components had never been tested in the conditions they would face, the exposed beaches of Normandy in the unpredictable weather of June. His anxiety proved in the event to be well-founded. A severe storm in the Channel on June 19th to 22nd, just 2 weeks after D-Day, severely damaged both the American Mulberry at Omaha Beach, which was so badly damaged it had to be abandoned, and the British Mulberry at Arromanches, which survived in reduced form. But Hughes Hallett, looking at the components before the invasion, could not know this. He could only hope that the weather would cooperate long enough for the harbours to establish themselves. The contrast between British and American approaches to problem-solving was nowhere more visible than in the development of specialised armoured vehicles for the D-Day assault. The British Army, under the direction of Major General Percy Hobart, had developed a range of modified tanks specifically designed to address the tactical problems of an assault landing on a defended coast. These vehicles, collectively known as Hobart's Funnies, included tanks fitted with flails to detonate mines, tanks with fascines for crossing anti-tank ditches, tanks with bridge-laying equipment for crossing gaps and obstacles, armoured personnel carriers modified from tank hulls, and the swimming duplex drive, or DD tanks that were fitted with flotation screens allowing them to swim ashore from landing craft. These specialised vehicles represented a systematic British approach to solving specific tactical problems with specially designed tools. The Americans had been offered Hobart's vehicles and had accepted some of them, but had declined others in favour of their own approaches or of simply relying on infantry to deal with tactical obstacles. This decision would have consequences on D-Day, particularly at Omaha Beach, where the loss of many of the DD tanks in heavy seas left the assault infantry without the armoured support that would have helped them on the exposed beach. British and Canadian troops on Gold, Juno and Sword beaches, supported by Hobart's vehicles, generally experienced fewer casualties and cleared their beaches more quickly than the Americans at Omaha. And while this comparison is complicated by many other factors, the specialised armour played a significant role. Hobart himself, watching the preparations from his headquarters, was acutely aware of the potential consequences of the American decision to decline some of his vehicles, but there was nothing more to be done about it by May 1944. Hobart was a remarkable and difficult figure, a tanker's tanker who had spent much of the pre-war years fighting the British Army's institutional conservatism on the subject of armoured warfare, and had been prematurely retired as a result, only to be recalled to service and given the 79th Armoured Division to develop his specialised vehicles. His relationship with the conventional military hierarchy was prickly, but the value of his work was undeniable. When he reviewed the 79th Armoured Division's equipment in the weeks before D-Day, he saw in concrete form the vindication of years of argument and experiment. The flail tanks worked, the bridge layers worked, the DD tanks in reasonable sea conditions worked. Whether the sea conditions on D-Day morning would be reasonable was, as always, a matter of weather. Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, returning now to complete his story, had by the spring of 1944 settled into his role as a staff officer rather than a commander, but his perspective on the fleet was shaped by his unique position as the man who had conceived the invasion before its specific shape had been determined. He had seen it grow from a planning concept when it existed only as a set of tables and diagrams in a London office, through the debates and revisions that had expanded it from 3 divisions to 5, through the allocation of resources that had turned paper commitments into real ships and real men, and now to its final physical form in the anchorages of southern England. Morgan wrote in his memoir that there was something almost vertiginous about this experience. He had spent so long living with the plan as an abstraction that its translation into physical reality was, at times, disorienting. He would stand in a harbour and look at an LST and think, that is the vessel that will carry 2 companies of infantry and 12 tanks to Utah Beach at H hour, according to the loading plan that my staff worked out 6 months ago. And the strangeness was that the plan was real. The ship existed. The infantry would be aboard it. The thing that had been a calculation was now a vessel with a crew and a purpose, and a route and a time. Morgan found this simultaneously satisfying and sobering, and he said that the sight of the fleet was, above everything else, a reminder that every decision made in a planning room has consequences that affect real people. His specific comments about the American contribution were, as always, nuanced. Morgan respected American organizational capacity enormously and was vocal about it in his memoir. He was less certain about American strategic judgment, which he considered at times too impatient and too focused on direct confrontation when indirect approaches might have been more economical. But he recognized that these differences in approach were partly cultural, partly military historical, and partly a product of the very different experiences that Britain and America had had in the first years of the war. Britain had learned caution through repeated failure. America had arrived with confidence bred from inexperience, but it had also brought the resources that caution alone could not have provided. The question of casualties was never far from any British officer's mind in the spring of 1944, and it profoundly shaped how British commanders looked at the American fleet. British manpower was, by 1944, nearly exhausted. The army was struggling to find reinforcements for existing divisions, let alone to form new ones. Churchill had been warned by his military advisers that Britain might not be able to sustain the losses that a major continental campaign was likely to inflict. American manpower, by contrast, seemed inexhaustible. The United States was still drafting men in 1944 at a rate that would add millions of soldiers to the rolls by the end of the year. British officers watching the American troops board their ships in the harbours of southern England could not help being aware of this contrast, and it coloured their reactions with a complex mixture of gratitude and melancholy. The melancholy was partly about the future. By June 1944, it was clear to anyone who thought about it seriously that the war was going to be won, and that when it was won, the world would be organised very differently than it had been in 1939. Britain would be one of the victors, but American power, military, industrial, financial, demographic, was so vastly superior to British power that the post-war world would be an American world in ways that the British Empire had never been a British world. Some British officers found ways not to think about this. Others could not avoid it, and when they stood on the shores of southern England and watched the American fleet, they were looking not only at the instrument of liberation, but also at the harbinger of a new world order in which Britain's place would be rather different from what it had been before the war. This is not to suggest that British feelings about the American fleet were primarily negative or resentful. Overwhelmingly, they were not. The dominant emotions in the accounts of those who were there were admiration, relief, and determination. Admiration for what American industry and American organizational energy had accomplished. Relief that the United States was in the fight and that it was going to stay in the fight until the end. And determination to see the enterprise through, to justify the sacrifices that had been made to bring this army and this fleet to the shores of France, and to make sure that what was accomplished was done in a way that honoured the planning and the preparation that had gone into it. The troops themselves, the British and American soldiers who were going to do the fighting, had their own reactions to the fleet, and these reactions were, in many ways, simpler and more direct than those of the senior commanders. Private soldiers and junior NCOs who saw the fleet for the first time in the harbours of Southampton, Portsmouth, Weymouth and Dartmouth described their reactions in terms that were consistent across hundreds of memoirs and interviews. They felt simultaneously more confident and more frightened. More confident because the sheer size of the force made individual survival seem more probable. More frightened because the sheer size of the force made the operation seem more real, more consequential, more irreversible. You could tell yourself before you saw the fleet that something might prevent the invasion from happening, that circumstances might change, that the plan might be altered. Once you had seen 10,000 ships, you knew that nothing was going to prevent it. The invasion was happening. You were part of it. You were going to France. General Sir Bernard Montgomery, returning to him now after considering the reactions of so many of his British colleagues, had one characteristic that set him apart from almost every other senior commander in the Allied hierarchy. He expressed almost no doubt about the outcome. Where Brooke worried, where Churchill wept, where Ramsay hoped, Montgomery simply expected success. He had a gift for certainty that was psychologically crucial in the weeks before the invasion, when even the most confident officer might have been forgiven for quiet moments of fear. Montgomery went among his troops in those weeks and told them, with a conviction that many found genuinely infectious, that the plan was good, the forces were sufficient, and the enemy would be defeated. He believed what he said, or at least he acted so convincingly that the difference was irrelevant. His specific comments about the American forces were expressed most clearly in a letter he wrote to Field Marshal Brooke in late May 1944, a letter that was not published until decades after the war, and which contained some of his most candid assessments. He wrote that the American soldier was individually brave and physically capable, but that American commanders had not yet fully internalized the lesson, learned at such cost by the British, that bravery and capability must be applied with economy and precision. He worried that American commanders, under the pressure of public and political expectation for rapid results, might drive their men into costly frontal attacks when methodical operations supported by firepower would accomplish more at less cost. He did not think this worry would undermine the invasion itself, which was, in his view, too large and too well prepared to fail. But he worried about what came after. This worry proved, in the event, to be partially justified. American operations in the bocage country of Normandy in the weeks after D-Day were costly and sometimes poorly coordinated. The terrain, with its dense hedgerows and sunken lanes, was ideally suited for defence and extremely difficult for armoured forces to exploit. American commanders struggled with the bocage longer than Montgomery's plan had anticipated, and the resulting frustration generated real tension between Montgomery and his American subordinates. But when the Americans finally broke through at St. Lo at the end of July with Operation Cobra, they demonstrated exactly the kind of operational boldness that more methodical commanders had failed to match, and the exploitation that followed, Patton's armoured thrust through Brittany and then east toward Paris, was one of the great feats of armoured warfare of the entire war. What British generals said when they saw America's invasion fleet then was not one thing but many things, shaped by their individual personalities, their professional experiences, their national loyalties, and their particular positions in the Allied command structure. Alan Brooks saw it and felt both admiration and the bittersweet awareness that British strategic primacy was passing to America. Bertram Ramsay saw it and felt the professional satisfaction of an organiser who has brought an enormous enterprise to the point of execution. Trafford Leigh-Mallory saw it and worried about what would happen if his predictions about the airborne landings proved correct. Arthur Tedder saw it and thought about air power and the transportation plan. Frederick Morgan saw it and thought about the difference between plans on paper and operations in the field. Bernard Montgomery saw it and felt, or claimed to feel, no doubt whatsoever. What all of them shared beneath the differences of temperament and professional emphasis was an awareness that what they were seeing in those harbours was unique in the history of warfare. Nothing like it had ever been assembled before. Nothing like it would ever be assembled again. And all of them understood, at some level, that the outcome of those ships' voyage would determine the shape of the world for generations to come. To understand the full dimensions of what British commanders were looking at when they surveyed the invasion fleet, it helps to spend some time with the numbers. Operation Neptune, the naval phase of Overlord, involved vessels from 8 Allied navies. The Royal Navy contributed the largest number of warships: 2 battleships, 17 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. The United States Navy contributed 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and a comparable array of smaller warships. The bombardment squadrons that would fire at the German beach defences on the morning of June 6th included some of the most powerful naval weapons afloat, with the American battleships USS Nevada, USS Arkansas, and USS Texas contributing their 14-inch and 12-inch guns to the effort alongside the British HMS Warspite, HMS Ramillies, and HMS Roberts. The Naval Gunfire Support Plan for D-Day was one of the most complex fire support operations in the history of naval warfare. Each beach was assigned specific warships responsible for engaging specific targets at specific times. The fire plans were coordinated with the air bombing that would precede the landings and with the artillery that would begin firing from the landing craft as they approached the shore. Shore fire control parties, small groups of naval officers and ratings embedded with the assault infantry, were responsible for calling in naval gunfire on targets they identified after landing. The system required a degree of real-time communication across multiple platforms, ships, aircraft, and troops on the ground that had never been attempted on this scale before. Rear Admiral Alan Kirk commanded the Western Naval Task Force responsible for the American beaches, and his opposite number for the British and Canadian beaches was Rear Admiral Philip Vian, one of the Royal Navy's most aggressive and capable fighting admirals. Vian had made his name in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean with a series of dashing actions that had given him a reputation as one of the Navy's best sea fighters. His appointment to command the Eastern Naval Task Force brought a welcome offensive spirit to the planning process, and his interactions with his American counterpart were generally productive, despite the occasional friction that characterized all Anglo-American professional relationships in this period. Vian's reaction to the assembled fleet was recorded by his flag lieutenant, who noted that the admiral spent considerably longer than usual studying the anchorages on a tour in late May. Vian was known for his brevity in professional matters, but on this occasion he made an observation that his flag lieutenant preserved in his diary. Vian said that the sight reminded him of something he had read as a boy about the Spanish Armada, except that this armada was going in the right direction. It was, for Vian, a remarkably literary observation, and it suggests that even the most practically minded of naval officers was moved, by the sight of the fleet, to reach for historical comparisons that might capture its significance. The Spanish Armada of 1588 had comprised approximately 130 ships carrying some 20,000 men. The D-Day fleet comprised nearly 7,000 vessels, carrying nearly 200,000 men in the assault phase alone, with several million more to follow. The troop numbers are as important as the ship numbers in understanding what British commanders were reacting to. The immediate assault force for D-Day comprised approximately 156,000 troops, who would land on the beaches on June 6th itself. Behind them was the first follow-up force, which would come ashore over the next few days, and behind that were the many hundreds of thousands of men who would be fed into the bridgehead as it expanded and consolidated. By the end of June 1944, more than 1 million Allied soldiers were ashore in Normandy. By the end of the campaign in August, that figure had grown to nearly 2 million. The logistics of sustaining this force, the food, fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles, medical supplies and equipment were handled by a supply organisation of extraordinary complexity that operated continuously from D-Day until the end of the war in Europe. General Sir Humphrey Gale was the Chief Administrative Officer at SHAEF, the man responsible for the logistics of the entire Allied campaign. He was, perhaps, the most important officer that most people have never heard of because logistics rarely make headlines, but the failure of logistics loses wars. Gale had spent the years before D-Day working through the administrative requirements of the Overlord Plan with a thoroughness that matched Ramsay's work on the naval side and Lee Mallory's work on the air side. He knew exactly how many tons of supplies per day the Allied forces would require at each stage of the campaign, and he had worked out in considerable detail how those supplies were going to be delivered. The Mulberry harbours were a crucial element of his calculations, but so were the plans for capturing and rehabilitating existing French ports, the air supply arrangements for isolated forward units, and the fuel pipeline systems that were to run under the Channel from Britain to France. Gale's reaction to the fleet was, perhaps predictably, one of a logistician who could see the supply chain made concrete. He noted the presence of ammunition ships whose distinctive silhouettes and careful positioning far from other vessels reflected the danger of their cargo. He noted the tankers that would be among the most critical vessels in the follow-on phase, when the expansion of the bridgehead and the exploitation phase would create enormous demands for fuel. He noted the hospital ships with their distinctive Red Cross markings standing off from the main anchorages, already prepared for the casualties that D-Day would generate. The presence of those hospital ships was, for Gale, as for many others who saw them, a sobering reminder that this beautiful and powerful fleet was going to battle, and that battle meant killing and being killed. The German awareness of what was building in southern England is a crucial element of the D-Day story that deserves attention in any account of the fleet. The Germans knew that an invasion was coming. They did not know where or when. The elaborate Allied deception operations, Operation Bodyguard with its multiple sub-plans including Fortitude North, which threatened Norway, and Fortitude South, which threatened the Pas-de-Calais, had convinced the German High Command that the main blow would fall on the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The German 15th Army, the largest German force in the west, was deployed opposite Calais. The 7th Army, a weaker formation, held Normandy. The strategic deception worked so well that even after D-Day, when Allied troops were ashore in Normandy, Hitler and many of his commanders continued to believe that the Normandy landing was a feint and that the real invasion was still to come. This belief, which Operation Fortitude did everything possible to reinforce, caused the Germans to hold back their panzer reserves for nearly 7 weeks after the landing. The success of the deception plan depended, in part, on the Germans not knowing how large the force assembled in England really was. British signals intelligence, the famous Ultra, derived from the breaking of German Enigma ciphers, allowed the Allies to monitor German understanding of the build-up and to manage the flow of information that reached Berlin. The Germans had their own intelligence sources in Britain, but the double-cross system run by MI5 had turned virtually every German agent operating in England and was feeding them carefully crafted disinformation that supported the story of a main attack at Calais. The combination of Ultra and the double-cross system gave Allied commanders a degree of insight into German thinking that was, in strategic terms, worth an army corps. British intelligence officers who were privy to Ultra and who observed the assembled fleet did so with the particular knowledge that the Germans did not fully understand what they were seeing. The Luftwaffe flew reconnaissance missions over southern England, but these were regularly intercepted by RAF fighters, and the Germans were never able to build a complete picture of the force assembling in the ports and anchorages. The German estimate of Allied strength was consistently too low, partly because the double-cross system was so effective and partly because the German intelligence system in Britain had been entirely compromised. The reality of the invasion fleet, had the Germans been able to see it in its entirety, would have caused considerably more alarm in Berlin than the distorted picture that reached German intelligence chiefs in the spring of 1944. General Sir Colin Gubbins commanded the Special Operations Executive, the organisation responsible for supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe and for conducting sabotage operations behind enemy lines. SOE was not a conventional military organisation, and Gubbins was not a conventional military man, but his role in the D-Day story was significant. In the weeks and months before the invasion, SOE networks throughout France had been given a set of targets to attack as part of Operation Plan Violet, which aimed to disrupt German communications and troop movements in the critical hours and days after the landing. French resistance fighters, supplied and trained by SOE, would cut telephone lines, block rail lines, sabotage fuel supplies, and attack German convoys, activities that were designed to slow the movement of German reserves toward Normandy and to create the confusion that would give the landing forces time to consolidate their bridgehead. Gubbins's perspective on the fleet was coloured by his awareness of the human networks in occupied France that were intended to complement it. For him, the fleet represented not just Allied military power, but the culmination of years of clandestine work that had built the relationships and the infrastructure through which French resistance could be mobilised. He had visited SOE networks in the field, had met the French men and women who were risking their lives to prepare for the moment that the fleet was now approaching, and he understood, perhaps better than most senior British officers, the full human complexity of what was being attempted. The fleet was the spearhead, but the spearhead was embedded in a much larger enterprise that extended from the ports of southern England to the farm kitchens and city apartments of occupied France. The relationship between the conventional military forces and the resistance organisations they were intended to support was one of the recurrent tensions of the Liberation Campaign. Conventional military commanders tended to regard resistance forces as useful supplements, but were reluctant to allow them a decisive role in operational planning. Resistance leaders, for their part, were sometimes frustrated by the Allied tendency to use them as auxiliary forces rather than as partners in the liberation of their own country. Gubbins occupied a difficult position between these two worlds, and his assessment of the fleet reflected this. He saw it as powerful and necessary but insufficient on its own, dependent for its full effectiveness on the cooperation of people who were not in the chain of command and who could not be ordered around in the way that soldiers could. The specialised intelligence and deception operations that accompanied the fleet's preparation came together in one of the most consequential moments of the entire war on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, when Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable were executed. These were RAF operations designed to simulate large naval forces crossing the Channel toward the Pas-de-Calais and the Dieppe area, using carefully positioned aircraft dropping metal foil strips that created radar signatures resembling a large convoy. The operations were coordinated with the movements of real vessels that were also participating in the deception, and they succeeded in convincing German radar operators that a large naval force was approaching the French coast many miles north of the actual landing area. This convinced the Germans to hold their reserves in place, while the real invasion went ashore at Normandy. British electronic warfare specialists who planned and executed these operations were, in a real sense, the most effective British contribution to the security of the fleet on that critical night. Air Commodore Colin Mackay Grierson was the officer responsible for coordinating the air plan for Operation Neptune with the naval plan, a role that required him to understand both the air and naval perspectives and to translate between them in a headquarters where the two perspectives sometimes clashed. His position was a relatively junior one in the overall hierarchy, but his practical responsibilities were considerable, and his observations on the fleet are preserved in a set of informal notes he made at the time. Grierson noted, with some pride, that the timing and coordination of the D-Day operations represented a degree of joint planning, Army, Navy and Air Force, working together, that the British military had not been capable of at the beginning of the war. The disasters of the Norwegian campaign in 1940, where poor coordination between the services had contributed to defeat, had prompted a long and sometimes painful process of reform that had produced, by 1944, a genuine capacity for joint operations that neither the Royal Navy, the Army, nor the RAF could have delivered individually. The fleet he was looking at was the physical expression of that capacity, and the fact that it included American, Canadian, and other Allied contributions made it all the more remarkable. His specific comments on the American contribution focused on what he called systematic professionalism. He had observed American planning and preparation closely enough to form a clear view of how the American military approached complex operations, and his conclusion was that the Americans applied a systematic approach to problem solving that was genuinely impressive. They broke problems down into components, assigned responsibility clearly, established measurable objectives, and then devoted resources to achieving those objectives with a thoroughness that sometimes seemed excessive, but was rarely inadequate. This approach, which Grierson contrasted with what he saw as a sometimes more intuitive British method, had produced an American contribution to the fleet that was technically excellent and logistically formidable, even if the American operational style remained, in his view, less subtle than the British one. The question of subtlety versus mass is, in many ways, the central tension in any assessment of Anglo-American military cooperation in the Second World War. British military culture, shaped by decades of imperial policing, colonial campaigning, and the hard-won lessons of the First and Second World Wars, tended to value precision, economy of force, and the exploitation of superior intelligence and planning. American military culture, shaped by a different history and driven by a nation with the resources to try things on a very large scale, tended to value mass, firepower, speed, and the willingness to accept high rates of attrition in exchange for decisive results. Both approaches had their strengths and their weaknesses. The Normandy campaign demonstrated both. Where British methodology excelled was in the detailed planning that underpinned the operation. The fire plans, the deception schemes, the signals intelligence, the specialized equipment. Where American methodology excelled was in the scale and speed of the build-up, the willingness to absorb early setbacks and keep pressing, and ultimately in the armoured exploitation that broke the German defences in late July. The invasion fleet was, in its physical form, a product of both British naval tradition and organisational experience combined with American industrial power and operational energy to produce something that neither could have created alone. Field Marshal Sir John Dill had a unique perspective on the Anglo-American alliance because he served from December 1941 until his death in November 1944 as the senior British military representative in Washington. Dill had been chief of the Imperial General Staff before Brooke, and when Churchill replaced him with Brooke, he was seen as a spent force. His appointment to Washington could have been a humiliating exile. Instead, he transformed it into one of the most important roles in the Allied war effort. Through his personal relationships with American military leaders, particularly with General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, Dill became the indispensable human connection between British and American strategic planning. He was trusted by both sides in a way that almost no other officer was, and his role in preventing the inter-Allied disagreements of the wartime period from becoming irreparable breaks was incalculable. Dill did not visit the assembled invasion fleet because he was in Washington throughout the build-up period, but he saw the fleet in another sense, in the daily reports, the conference agendas, the logistical tables, and the strategic assessments that crossed his desk in the combined Chiefs of Staff building. And he understood, perhaps more clearly than any other British officer, what the fleet represented in terms of the American commitment to Europe. He had spent 3 years navigating the complex American policy landscape, managing the competing demands of the Pacific theatre, arguing for the priority of the European theatre, and explaining British strategy to Americans who were sometimes puzzled or frustrated by it. He knew what it had cost the United States to build the force that was now assembled in the ports of southern England, not just in money and material, but in political terms, in the arguments and compromises that had accompanied every major strategic decision. Dill was gravely ill by the spring of 1944, suffering from aplastic, anemia that would kill him in November. He knew he was dying, and this knowledge may have given his assessments of the fleet, made from Washington through the medium of documents and reports, a particular quality of finality and perspective. He wrote to Brooke in April 1944 that the force being assembled for Overlord was, in his judgment, the supreme expression of what the Anglo-American alliance had accomplished, and that whatever the outcome of the invasion, the fact that such an alliance had been created and maintained through years of difficulty and disagreement was itself a remarkable achievement. He died before the campaign reached its conclusion, but he knew by November 1944 that the Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were pressing toward Germany. The fleet had done its work. The stories of individual vessels in the D-Day fleet provide a more intimate perspective on the enterprise than the large-scale numbers can convey. HMS Warspite, one of the Royal Navy's most venerable battleships, had been launched in 1913 and had fought at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. She had been severely damaged by a German guided bomb off Salerno in September 1943 and had not been fully repaired when she was assigned to the bombardment force for D-Day. Her crew went into action knowing that their ship was operating at less than full capacity, with one engine room still out of service from the Italian campaign. But her 15-inch guns still worked perfectly, and she fired them in support of the British troops landing on Sword Beach with the same accuracy and effect that she had demonstrated in 3 decades of naval service. The USS Nevada, another veteran battleship that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, raised, repaired and modernized, was assigned to the bombardment force off Utah Beach. Her presence in those waters was rich with symbolic meaning. The ship that the Japanese had tried to sink 2.5 years earlier was now firing her guns at Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Her crew, many of whom had been through the Pearl Harbor attack, brought to D-Day a particular intensity of purpose that went beyond professional duty. When she opened fire on the German batteries at Azeville and Saint-Martin-de-Varville in the early morning of June 6th, she was, in a sense, completing a journey that had begun in the smoke and fire of Pearl Harbor. Stories like these, multiplied across hundreds of vessels in the fleet, gave the operation a human dimension that the statistics cannot fully capture. Every ship had a history, every crew had a story, every sailor had reasons of his own for being in those waters on that morning. The fleet was not an abstraction, it was an accumulation of individual lives, individual decisions, individual acts of courage and competence and commitment, organized by human intelligence and human will into an enterprise of world historical consequence. The British generals who stood on the cliffs and in the harbours and looked out at this fleet were looking not just at ships but at people, and they knew it. The relationship between the senior commanders and the troops they were sending into battle is always complex, and D-Day magnified this complexity to an almost unbearable degree. Montgomery, as he drove through the concentration areas in his distinctive staff car, stopping at unit after unit to address the soldiers and send them off with confidence, was performing a role that he had refined to something close to an art form over years of command. He understood the psychology of men going into battle, the particular combination of bravado and fear that occupies the mind of a soldier in the hours before action. And he knew that confidence from above, genuine, unqualified, expressed without hedging, was one of the most important things a commander could give his men at such moments. Eisenhower's approach was different in style, but similar in substance. On the evening of June 5th, as the transport aircraft carrying the American airborne troops were warming their engines on airfields across southern England, Eisenhower drove to the bases of the 101st Airborne Division and walked among the soldiers. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, wrote afterward that Eisenhower knew the airborne operation was the most dangerous aspect of the entire enterprise, that he had agonized over the decision to go ahead with it, and that he felt a personal responsibility for the men he was sending into the darkness. He talked with soldiers individually, asked where they were from, what they did in civilian life, whether they were ready. He was, Butcher wrote, visibly moved by the encounter. After the aircraft had taken off, Eisenhower turned to his driver and said, quietly, that he hoped to God he had been right to send them. This moment, the Supreme Commander watching the aircraft disappear into the night sky, uncertain whether he had made the right decision, knowing that, within hours he would know, captures something essential about what D-Day meant at the human level. The fleet, the plans, the logistics, the deception operations, the meteorological forecasts, all of these were instruments of human decision, and the decisions had been made by human beings who were not certain they were right and who knew that the consequences of being wrong were measured in lives. British and American commanders alike understood this, and the knowledge of it informed everything they saw when they looked at the fleet. The ships were powerful, and the plan was good, but the outcome was not guaranteed, and the weight of what was at stake was something that no professional composure could entirely suppress. The morning of June 6, 1944, began in darkness and noise. The airborne drops had gone in overnight, The bombers had attacked the beach defences in the small hours, and as dawn broke over the English Channel, the naval bombardment opened in earnest. The sound was described by those who heard it as something beyond the human scale, a continuous, overwhelming roar that made conversation impossible at distances of several miles, and that could be felt as a physical vibration in the chest, even at greater ranges. The battleships and cruisers were firing their heaviest guns at ranges of 10 to 15 miles, engaging the gun batteries that defended the beaches, the road junctions that would channel German reserves, and the command posts from which the defence would be directed. The British destroyers, in a notable feat of seamanship that drew admiring comments from the American naval officers who observed it, pushed in as close as possible to the British beaches before opening fire. Some of them were operating in water so shallow that their keels were scraping the bottom, a dangerous situation that their commanders accepted because it allowed them to engage targets on the beaches at ranges where their smaller guns could be devastating. Lieutenant Commander Neville Krieg Osborne, commanding one of the inshore destroyers, later wrote that he could see individual German soldiers running along the beach through his binoculars as his ship's guns fired over their heads at the bunkers behind. He said it was one of the most remarkable and terrible things he had ever witnessed. The landing craft carrying the assault infantry of the first wave were already approaching the beaches as the naval bombardment reached its climax. The sea was rougher than the planners had hoped, and the flat-bottomed Higgins boats were shipping water over their ramps and sides as they bucked through the 3 to 4 foot waves. Soldiers who had been cramped in their craft for hours were cold, wet, and many were violently seasick. The combination of physical discomfort, the thunder of the guns, the sight of the coast growing larger ahead of them, and the knowledge of what awaited them on those beaches was the most intense human experience that most of them had ever undergone or would ever undergo. The beaches themselves were about to receive the full weight of what the fleet had delivered. 5 beaches across 50 miles of coast. Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold for the British 50th Division, Juno for the Canadian 3rd Division, Sword for the British 3rd Division. Each beach had its specific defences, its specific fire plan, its specific sequence of events timed to the minute, in orders that had been prepared over months of careful staff work. The reality, as always, diverged from the plan almost immediately. On Omaha Beach, the divergence was catastrophic in the initial hours. The disaster at Omaha was the moment when British concerns about American tactical preparation and the vulnerability of troops without adequate armour support were most nearly vindicated. The DD tanks that were supposed to support the assault infantry were launched in sea conditions that the Sherman tank's flotation screen was not designed for. 27 of the 32 DD tanks launched by the 741st Tank Battalion foundered and sank before reaching the shore. 2 were destroyed by enemy fire. Only 5 made it to the beach. The infantry of the 1st and 29th Divisions went ashore without the armoured support that had been central to the fire plan, in front of defences that the preliminary bombing had largely missed because of poor visibility, against a German unit that happened to be on exercises and was unusually well prepared for the assault. The result was a near disaster that cost approximately 2,000 American casualties on D-Day. Brigadier Sir James Hargest, a New Zealand officer who was serving as an observer with the American First Army, watched the Omaha landing from a naval vessel and wrote a detailed report that is among the most candid assessments of the American performance in the initial assault. He noted that the American infantry showed individual bravery of the highest order, but that the tactical coordination between the different elements of the assault force, tanks, infantry, engineer teams, had broken down almost immediately on the beach. He noted that the absence of specialised armour of the kind that Hobart's 79th Armoured Division had provided on the British and Canadian beaches was a critical factor. He noted that American junior leaders, NCOs, and officers at the platoon and company level were making decisions of extraordinary difficulty and doing so for the most part with impressive resolution. And he noted that the situation on Omaha had been saved not by any specific feature of the plan, but by the fundamental quality of the individual soldier, specifically by officers like Colonel George Taylor, who reportedly told his men on the beach that 2 kinds of people were going to stay on this beach, the dead and those who were going to die, and that they had better get the hell inland. The British and Canadian landings on Gold, Juno and Sword were, by comparison, more successful in the immediate assault phase, though they were not without cost or confusion. On Gold Beach, the British 50th Division landed with the support of Hobart's DD tanks, which were launched close enough to shore to reach the beach safely, and of the flail tanks and bridge-laying vehicles that cleared paths through the minefields and anti-tank obstacles. The German defences were engaged by destroyers at close range and by the LCTs fitted with rockets that fired salvos of 5-inch projectiles in the final minutes before landing. The 50th Division's veterans, many of whom had fought in North Africa and Sicily, applied the lessons of those campaigns on the beaches of Normandy with a steadiness that their commanders found deeply reassuring. The Canadian experience on Juno Beach was more mixed. The 3rd Canadian Division had never been in action as a complete formation, though many of its soldiers were veterans of various smaller operations. The beach obstacles were dense, the underwater conditions were worse than expected, and the Canadian landing craft had to fight through the chaos of a beach that was simultaneously being cleared of obstacles and taken under fire. The Canadian casualties in the assault were significant, but the division fought through with a resolution that impressed even the most demanding British observers. Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, visiting the British Second Army sector later on D-Day, said that the Canadians had acquitted themselves with the kind of determination and skill that he had expected from them, but that it was good to have it confirmed. On Sword Beach, the British 3rd Division landed in the sector closest to Caen, the city that was Montgomery's primary D-Day objective. The 3rd Division had a specific mission: to capture Caen on the first day or get close enough to threaten it. This objective was not achieved on June 6th. And the failure to take Caen on D-Day is one of the most discussed controversies of the entire campaign. The reasons for it are complex. The German 21st Panzer Division, commanded by General Edgar Feuchtinger, moved faster than expected, and the British armoured thrust toward Caen ran into its counterattack in the afternoon. But the debate over whether more could have been done on D-Day itself began almost immediately, and it continues to this day. What is not debated is that the fleet accomplished its primary mission. On the evening of June 6, 1944, approximately 156,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy. All 5 beaches had been secured. The airborne divisions, despite the scattered drops, had accomplished most of their key objectives. The beachhead was shallow in places, and the Germans would counterattack vigorously in the days that followed, but the invasion had succeeded. The largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare had done what it was designed to do. The senior British commanders who had spent the day in various command posts on ships or at Southwick House received the reports through the day and night with a mixture of relief, anxiety, and professional calculation. Ramsay's headquarters monitored the progress of the naval operation with particular intensity, tracking the movement of the convoys, the progress of the minesweeping operations, the status of the beach traffic control, and the countless other details that determined whether the logistics of the operation were working. By midnight on June 6th, Ramsay's reports showed that while Omaha Beach had been a close-run thing, the overall Neptune operation had achieved its objectives. His diary entry for that day is characteristically restrained. He noted that the operation had gone better than he had dared hope, that the weather had held, and that the casualties, while painful, were within the range that had been anticipated. Brooke spent D-Day in London, receiving reports through the day and evening. His diary entry for June 6th is one of the most revealing he ever made. He wrote that by evening it appeared that the operation had gone well, that the casualties were less than had been feared, and that the foothold was secure. He then wrote something that is often quoted and that deserves to be. He wrote that 5 years of war had come to this day, and that the outcome of those 5 years, the survival of Britain, the building of the coalition, the development of the strategy that had produced Overlord, was not something that any individual could claim credit for, but was rather the product of a national effort, of which he could be grateful to have been a part. For Brooke, who was not given to sentiment and who had carried the burden of British strategy throughout the war with a stoicism that masked its personal cost, this was an unusually open expression of feeling. The fleet had done its work, and he was grateful. Montgomery's D-Day diary entry was, characteristically, confident. He noted that the operations had proceeded broadly according to plan, that certain objectives had not been reached but that the position was satisfactory, and that he was looking forward to the campaign ahead. He expressed particular satisfaction with the performance of the British and Canadian troops, and he noted, with his characteristic precision, that the German response had been slower and less coordinated than the worst-case planning assumptions. He was correct in this observation. The German command system, confused by the deception operations and by Hitler's insistence on personal control of the panzer reserves, had failed to respond to the landings with the speed and mass that might have been decisive in the first critical hours. Lee Mallory's D-Day ended with the letter to Eisenhower that he had been composing, mentally, since the airborne aircraft had taken off. He wrote that he had been wrong in his predictions about the airborne casualties, that he was delighted to have been wrong, and that the success of the airborne operations had been an important factor in the overall success of the day. He acknowledged Eisenhower's decision to overrule him as correct, and he said so clearly and without qualification. It was, by all accounts, a genuinely gracious letter, and Eisenhower responded warmly. The exchange represents something of the best of the Anglo-American professional relationship. Genuine disagreement expressed frankly, a decision taken, and the outcome accepted honestly. The weeks and months after D-Day brought new complications and new arguments to the Anglo-American alliance, as the campaign in Normandy ground through the bocage and the patience of American commanders wore thin. The controversy over Montgomery's management of the Caen sector became one of the most bitter inter-allied arguments of the entire war. American officers, led by the increasingly outspoken Patton and supported by Bradley, felt that Montgomery was too slow, too cautious, and too willing to accept stalemate in the British sector while demanding American effort in the West. Montgomery insisted that his plan was working, that he was attracting and destroying German armoured reserves while creating the conditions for an American breakout. The historical debate about who was right continues, but what is not debated is that when the American breakout finally came at St. Lo in late July with Operation Cobra, it was spectacularly successful, and the subsequent exploitation swept through Brittany and toward Paris with a speed that demonstrated the full offensive potential of the American army at its best. Field Marshal Brooke, watching this from London, adjusted his assessments as the campaign proceeded. He had been sceptical of American operational ability. What he saw in Normandy and in the breakout was something more impressive than he had expected. He did not entirely abandon his view that British strategic direction was superior to American, but he acknowledged, with increasing frequency in his diary, that the American army was learning and improving faster than he had thought possible. By the time the campaign reached Germany in early 1945, he was capable of expressing genuine, unqualified admiration for American military performance in terms that would have seemed impossible to him in June 1944. Montgomery himself never entirely revised his assessment of American tactical methods, and this stubbornness contributed to his eventual removal from command of all ground forces, a role he had held since D-Day, in September 1944 when Eisenhower took personal command of the ground campaign. The removal was a public humiliation for Montgomery, who had grown accustomed to his position as the senior ground commander, and he did not accept it gracefully. His continued advocacy for a single concentrated thrust rather than the broad front strategy that Eisenhower preferred became a source of increasingly bitter controversy that lasted not just through the end of the war, but through decades of historical writing. But whatever the subsequent controversies, the fleet that the British generals had watched in the harbours of southern England in May 1944 had accomplished something that none of those generals, even the most pessimistic among them, would have denied. It had crossed the Channel, it had put men and machines ashore on a defended coast, it had maintained supply across open beaches in conditions that would have seemed impossible before the war, and it had sustained the army that ultimately destroyed the Third Reich. The German garrison of western France, which had spent years preparing the Atlantic Wall as an impenetrable barrier against invasion, had been unable to prevent the fleet from accomplishing its mission. The British generals who had doubted American readiness had been obliged to watch American soldiers prove themselves in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The British generals who had admired American power from a distance had seen that power translate into operational reality, and the British generals who had worried about the weather, the obstacles, the deception, the airborne drops, and the 1,000 other uncertainties of the operation had been given, by the events of June 6th, the most vivid possible demonstration of what can be accomplished when preparation, cooperation, and a measure of luck converge at the right moment. The men who had planned and commanded and watched the D-Day operation would carry its memory for the rest of their lives. Ramsey was killed in an aircraft accident in January 1945 and never saw the final victory he had done so much to make possible. Lee Mallory was killed in another air accident in November 1944, flying to take up a new command in the Far East. Dill had already died in Washington in November 1944, worn out by the demands of his extraordinary role as the human bridge between the British and American military establishments. These men gave everything they had to the enterprise, and some of them gave their lives. Of those who survived, most wrote memoirs that attempted to capture what the experience had meant. Brooks' diaries, published in 1957 and 1959, provoked controversy because of the candor of his criticisms of Allied personalities, including Eisenhower. Morgan's memoir, published in 1950, was more measured but equally revealing in its account of the planning process. Montgomery's multiple volumes of autobiography were characteristically self-justifying but contained, beneath the polished surface, genuine insights into the moral and psychological demands of supreme command. What all of these accounts shared, beneath the self-justifications and the arguments and the settling of old scores, was a recognition that D-Day had been something genuinely unprecedented. A cooperative military enterprise on a scale that had never been attempted before, conducted by nations that had not always agreed about how to do it, under conditions of uncertainty and danger that no amount of planning could entirely remove. And the fleet that the British generals had watched leaving its harbours in the early hours of June 6, 1944, had been the physical expression of that enterprise, its most tangible and most powerful symbol. When those ships sailed, they carried not just soldiers and equipment, but the hopes of every occupied country in Europe, the determination of the nations that had chosen to resist tyranny, and the memory of every man and woman who had fought and died in the preceding 5 years to make this moment possible. The generals who stood on those cliffs and in those harbours and watched it go understood this, each in his own way. Some expressed it in the formal language of military dispatches. Some wrote it in private diaries that they never expected to be published. Some said it to colleagues in unguarded moments of confidence that were later remembered and recorded. And some of them never found words adequate to what they had seen. Frederick. Morgan, the man who had planned the invasion before its commander had been appointed, wrote in the final pages of his memoir that there were moments in a human life that exceeded language, and that the sight of the invasion fleet leaving for Normandy had been, for him, one of those moments. He had stood on a cliff in southern England and watched the greatest armada in history sail past him, and he had known, with a certainty that required no supporting argument, that the world was about to change. He was right. The world did change. The fleet went to Normandy, the soldiers went ashore, the battle was won, and the road that began on those beaches in June 1944 led through 11 more months of fighting and dying to the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945. What the British generals said when they saw America's invasion fleet for D-Day was, in the end, less important than what the fleet itself said, that the free nations of the world, for all their disagreements and rivalries and mutual frustrations, could assemble the power and the will to confront and defeat the worst tyranny of the modern age. The fleet said it in the language of steel and smoke and engine noise, and the message was heard in Berlin and in every corner of occupied Europe, and its echo has not entirely faded even now, 80 years later, when the last men who were there have passed away, and their story belongs entirely to history. The argument over credit for D-Day, who planned it best, who contributed most, who deserved the most recognition, is one that historians will continue to conduct, and rightly so, because the answers to those questions matter for understanding how the operation came together and what it tells us about military cooperation and national power. But the argument over credit should not obscure the more fundamental truth, which is that D-Day was an achievement of human cooperation on a scale that remains, in the history of warfare, without parallel. British intelligence, British naval tradition, British operational experience, British courage, and British determination contributed enormously to its success. American industry, American manpower, American organizational energy, American boldness and American sacrifice contributed enormously to its success, and the smaller nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Poland, France, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium and others, contributed in ways that were out of all proportion to their size because they were fighting for something that mattered most deeply to them, the liberation of their own countries and the defeat of the regime that had occupied and oppressed them. What the British generals saw when they looked at America's invasion fleet was a partnership made concrete, an alliance made visible, a decision made irreversible. Whatever they said about it, and they said many things, some admiring, some critical, some simply awed, the sight of that fleet changed them as It changed everyone who saw it. And the change was permanent because what it showed them was something they could not unsee. The possibility of a world organised around cooperation rather than competition, around shared purpose rather than national self-interest, around the willingness to put aside rivalry and jealousy and suspicion in service of something larger than any one nation's ambition. That the world did not remain organised around those principles after 1945 is a tragedy of a different kind. But the fleet existed, and it sailed, and it succeeded, and the memory of what it accomplished remains a reference point for what humanity can achieve when it chooses to try. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that it gave you a deeper appreciation for the complexity and human drama behind the greatest military operation in history. If you enjoyed learning about D-Day from the perspective of the men who planned and commanded it, make sure to check out our other videos covering the fascinating stories of World War II's most remarkable commanders, battles, and campaigns. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.